Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Jamal Reimer, author of Mega Deal Secrets and founder of the Enterprise Sellers Community. The topic of today's episode is closing eight-figure deals. Yes, eight-figure deals. For a lot of us listening to the podcast, that is an unfathomable number, but Jamal has actually closed 3 deals over $50 million. Which to me puts him in a category where few actually are. And so in today's episode, Jamal is going to talk about the mindset that it takes to close big deals. And I asked myself, do we want to bring a seller or a salesperson on the podcast? And my answer was yes, because when you hear how Jamal thinks and how he approaches business, it's just at a different level. And while you might be looking to close your first deal, you might still be looking to break into the profession. Your team has closed maybe multiple 7-figure deals. Hearing the mindset and hearing the shift in the approach that it takes to close 8-figure deals is just insightful to hear. And I don't want to preface too much, but you'll just hear how simple Jamal makes it sound. We talk about team selling, staying and talking with executives, and most importantly, we talk about value engineering's impact on these 8-figure deals. Enjoy.
Today's episode is sponsored by Consensus. Scale your pre-sales organization and deliver better experiences with intelligent demo automation. Experience an interactive video demo at goconsensus.com.
Hi there, my name is Yuji Higashi, co-founder of PreSales Collective, and I have big news to share with you if you're a pre-sales leader or an individual contributor early in your career. We recently launched 2 training and enablement programs aimed at helping you take your career to the next level. Both programs were created by pre-sales leaders with input from dozens of SC veterans across our community. Now, we'll be running cohorts each month, so if you're interested in participating, visit us at presalescollective.com/enablement to submit an inquiry, and we'll send you details about each program, including this curriculum and schedule. We look forward to working with you on growing your career and being part of your career journey. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon.
Jamal, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How's it going?
It's awesome. So glad to be here, James.
We don't have too many sellers on the podcast, but you're a different level of salesperson. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today. You know, we've got to know each other. I'm not entirely sure that over the last year and a half. And I just love your approach to sales. I love your approach to business. And, you know, when I'm thinking about the podcast and how we can continue to up-level the solutions profession, I thought, why not bring somebody on the podcast who's closed multiple 8-figure deals? It's even crazy to say, Jamal. Let me ask you, how many 8-figure deals have you closed in your career?
3.
That's unbelievable. And what kind of total revenue on those deals?
So all of them were at or over 50. So if you total it up, it's basically 160 million over 8 years.
That is unbelievable. And I'm excited to talk about that. But let's learn a little bit more about you, Jamal. So can you tell us your career journey? Like, what got you to where you are today?
The first thing I ever sold was books. I used to sell books in the summer to pay for college. A company called Southwestern out of Nashville, Tennessee. Did that for 5 summers. The first summer I sucked. I cried on the curb after so many rejections from door-to-door slams in my face. Somehow made it back for a second summer and then started to get better. And by the end, I was doing pretty good. Fast forward some years, I was a co-founder of a startup in Seattle, lasted 2 years. Right in the dot-com bubble. I really know how to pick the top. And we folded the business after I had done most of the fundraising from friends and family. So I was carrying a lot of emotional baggage from having friends and family's investment just evaporate. So I needed a job. So the first job that I got was at a software company outside of Chicago called Interface Software. And they hired me because I had a background in financial services, even including the startup that I did. So they said, well, heck, let's give him a sales job. And that's where my enterprise sales journey started. The next decade was a very bumpy decade of mediocre, sometimes good, sometimes mediocre performance, during which I was fired twice in a row for not underperformance, which left me, really just punched in the face and wondering if this was a space that I should stay in, which led me to somehow getting a job at Oracle. And I stayed at Oracle for 13 years. 2 years into my Oracle stint or career, I could say, I met my future wife. She's a physician in Sweden. And so I moved to Sweden so she could practice medicine because she would have to start over her training in the US. And within 2 years of that, I guess stumbled into learning this whole art of doing large deals. So the second decade of the career was more fulfilling and more successful.
Well, I'm excited to dig into that, Jamal, and I appreciate that. So for the topic of today's episode, we're going to talk about closing 8-figure deals, which again, when I even say that out loud, I'm like, wow, this is just the next level. There's just levels to this. But, as we were talking about ahead of this episode, I think for me, and so our audience knows kind of the premise, I want to talk about your mindset. I want to talk about your approach to these deals. I want to talk about team selling, because all these things matter when you're going after deals of this size. I've been no stranger to my philosophy about salespeople and solutions people in general. If you look at talent and you look at phenomenal, great, good, average, and below average, the delta between every group is pretty large. To work with great and phenomenal salespeople is a absolutely different experience than working with average or below average salespeople. And I don't always mean this against the people. Sometimes it's the company, it's the process, it's the leaders, it's the lack of training. But the reality is that there's just a different level to this. And I will be transparent that I've never experienced this type of level. So I'm excited just to dig in with you about this. And actually, to preface, something that you just said to me before we started recording was this concept of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Let's start there, Jamal. What does that mean to you? And why has it resonated with you in your career?
I've always been a dreamer, and I've always seen people who had done these amazing things. And when I was a child, I never could conceive that I would ever do anything like that. So I held them as kind of this demigod type of level. But as I grew up, not even far into my life, but like university, this idea that, I started resonating or hearing and really grabbing onto stories of people who were not superheroes, but yet they did some really impressive stuff. Some of them were children. Some of them were from disadvantaged backgrounds. Some of them didn't have arms or legs. Some of them had cognitive issues. And yet the output of their lives far outpaced the limitations that they had. And then I started to wonder if I could do something like that. So the rest of my life has become some kind of journey to figure out, okay, what is it that I'm going to do? Regardless of the capacities that I've been given, can I use whatever I got to do something meaningful?
It takes a leap of faith to put yourself out there and dream big like that. And the more that I talk to you, right, the more that I see that part of your DNA. And I want to actually bring up your book because I'm curious if the book of Mega Deal Secrets actually has something to do with seeing inspiration in others and has pushed you to propel forward and be able to share the things that you've learned in that journey. Is that an assumption on my end, or is there something there?
The spoken or unspoken premise of the book is that, so number one, I didn't do these great things alone. That's just the first baseline. I did not do these things alone. And I didn't figure it out on my own. I've done multiple, but I was brought into a deal which was with an ailing customer that was thinking of leaving, and they were not happy with us or our product. That's kind of the setting the stage. And over the next months, I was basically mentored by my head of sales and my head of services. We spent so much time with the customer and transformed how we worked with the customer so much, such a complete transformation that they went from doing contracts of $10 million to $50 million over that 9-month period. Only looking back on that experience could I see how much change happened and how much it was a team effort. So that's kind of the basis, that you don't have to be amazing or a rock star or a demigod to do amazing things. You have to work hard and you have to work smart and you have to really be in it.
I appreciate that, Jamal. And I think I want to talk about that progression of an organization to get started, because there's plenty of people listening to this podcast that would like $50 million deals. Like even myself, I'm like, how could I ever have achieved that in my organization? My organization's not ready for that. So could you talk about maybe the selling motions that change over time? Because most tech organizations specifically cannot walk into a company and say, hey, we're going to close this $8 million deal when maybe their business isn't even 8 figures today.
Those numbers just are not in scope for most solutions. And even the deals that I did was a mix of software and services. So as soon as you start to add up services hours for a multi-year contract, that number gets big quick. So I don't know if it's busting a bubble, but a significant portion of my deals were services as well as software wrapped up together. So that's one thing. But for another thing, it's kind of like once you know how to drive, regardless of licensing, you can drive a car or you can drive a moving van. There's an accelerator, there's a brake, maybe there's a clutch. And if you know how to work those on a car, you know how to work those on a moving van, even though it's 3, 4, 5 times as big as a car. That's an oversimplification by a long shot, but the principle holds.
Can you talk about an example of maybe a 8-figure deal that you closed and how it was so similar to maybe a smaller deal that was a quarter of the size or significantly less, and how there were similarities in that process?
So it can kind of be broken down to the metric that you sell by and then the scope of how many you sell. In my world, I was selling to pharmaceutical companies and in the R&D department. And the way that we charged was per clinical trial. Every time the pharmaceutical company would use our software, it would be to run a certain part of the process of the clinical trial. So we charged per clinical trial and how many subjects, how many countries, how many pages of information, et cetera. So that's how we'd come up with a price. We did lots of deals that were like 1 trial for this company, 1 trial for that company, 5 trials for this other company. And that gets you to anywhere from $150,000 to $2.5 million. But once you develop a relationship with that pharmaceutical company to the point where they say, we like your software so much that we don't want to consider 1 and 2 trials, why don't we look at doing all of our trials? And if you do this with a large enough company, you go from 1 to 5 trials to 50 to 100 trials. That's it, James. That's it.
You make it sound so easy, Jamal. You've become such an expert, but I think, when you break it down, you distill it, like you're running the play, you're running the process just across a wider band within an organization. And that is where things really start to take off. It's what I'm hearing is like, you have your approach. And if you can get your approach across multiple groups, multiple teams, organization wide, that's when the breakthrough happens. Is that an oversimplification of what you're saying?
It is, and it's accurate.
We've talked about a couple things outside of this podcast, and you talk about big deals. And in big deals, it's going to stretch an organization. It's going to stretch you because you need to be able to have a point of view. Your organization needs to be able to support. You can't oversell. But you've talked to me about this concept of 2 halves. So can you break down what 2 halves means in a large selling process?
It's another oversimplification, but it helps you see the whole field of play. I like to think that large enterprise selling has 2 halves, like many games. Global football, American football, there's the first half and there's the second half. Our job in our first half is an entire body of work just to get a senior customer stakeholder or a small number of senior stakeholders to listen to us with an open mind. Just getting to the table. Okay, James has credibility. His company has credibility. I'm ready to listen to this value proposition. That's an entire body of work, from prospecting to engagement, weeks, months, sometimes years of work just to get to the table. The second half of the game is to run a tight process and not screw it up.
Jamal, what I'm hearing is that you are very good at simplifying very complex situations. And that's what probably makes you really good at your job, because you're right. If you think about a large process with a ton of different stakeholders, you work all the way to the top to get to somebody. And if you don't have a point of view and you can't actually carry a conversation, you're right. You lose credibility, your team, your company, and probably you're breaking trust with that person, right? You've had someone who's helped you up that process. So I'm curious. I have felt that the point of view is the biggest challenge and biggest difference between good, great, phenomenal salespeople. So is that something that is just a solutions perspective, or do you, as a really successful seller, believe that's a core premise?
In my community, the enterprise sellers community, we have lots of top sellers. And one of them said to me, the point of view is my opener, and the opener is the new close.
Interesting.
If I can lay the foundation, if I can plant the seed of my idea, my point of view, in the first 5 minutes in giving a presentation to executives, I'm halfway to the conceptual sale.
How do you as a seller then continue to work upward in an organization? You said it could sometimes take weeks, months, years to get to that senior executive. How does that process go to get to that level within an organization?
There's the long way and the short way. The short way is really well-traveled. It's what most go-to-market teams are used to. And it makes this assumption that we are like mountain climbers. The job of the mountain climber is to hike up that mountain step by step, all by yourself until you reach the top. That could take days, that could take weeks to get to that summit. The shorter way is to not have the mentality of a mountain climber, but rather have the mentality of a heliskier. Where can I find a helicopter to get me to the top of the mountain in 10 minutes? So I can spend the rest of the day skiing down the other side. By and large, that's not just a strategy that I do. That's pretty much what I've seen every large deal, every mega dealer do. Get to power fast by leveraging existing relationships.
You talked about the team aspect, right? You never got here alone. And you've talked about how many different roles and resources you've utilized in the process to get to those executives. Because one, you said the first half is getting to the table, right? Having an executive buyer have an open mind to hear your point of view. I am curious, though, as we start talking about that second half, if you come from the top, how do you ensure you have enough of a point of view within limited interaction to make sure that someone will listen to you? How do you get credibility instantly?
Well, I guess you kind of acknowledge that you're part of the way there, because what you can do at that early stage, your point of view has not reached the point where you have this customer specific nail on the head insight, which I call a C-level insight. What you have is a hypothesis. You have a compelling hypothesis, which in oversimplified terms is, hey, Mrs. Executive, here's this value proposition that we have for you. If you build this capability, you'll be leaving the old world, which if you stay in the old world track, you're headed off a cliff like everybody else in your industry. You got to jump to this new world. And what you need is this capability. I'm not talking about a product. I don't say the word software. I don't say the name of our product. You need this new capability. If you get this new capability, your world is different and the way you operate is different, and you'll be high and right in Gartner Quadrant. We've done it with this one of your peer companies and this one and this one. And here's just a vignette or two about the measurable results that they got. But don't take my word for it. Let's take it for a spin. Because if I was in your shoes, I'd be saying, this is great. Sounds like it works for these other guys, but I don't know if it'll work for us. So let's take it for a spin. If you think this hypothesis is worth chasing, let's take it for a spin and see if it'll work.
So to get a deal of this size, a proof of concept is just absolutely mandatory, correct?
Correct, in my experience.
And I appreciate you breaking that down for us. So, okay, you get to the executive, you show that you're credible, you have that open mind, they want to push you down. How do you make sure you're staying up so that in the second half, you could start running the process and you're running it with the right people and the right buyers?
I call this part seeing around corners. And the only reason that I know anything about it is because I missed it so many times before. So often in the sales process, you might get a meeting or limited attention of somebody who really matters, never to get it back again. And so when you're in that early conversation, delivering a hypothesis, you're probably not doing it by yourself. You're probably bringing one of your own executives or somebody who has what I call peer business status, the person you're talking to. That's what I mean by leveraging existing relationships or leveraging others who already have this peer business status with the executive audience you're achieving. When you have this meeting to discuss a hypothesis, and when you say, hey, let's take this for a spin, you have to put some conditions into it, which is also a part of having this peer relationship. Taking a spin is going to be good for them, but it's also got to be good for you if you're going to be good partners. So what I do is I lay out some, I don't want to call them conditions, but they are conditions, right? Basically, we say something like, hey, Mrs. Executive, we'll do this proof of value exercise, whatever it is, a POC, a pilot, a conference room exercise, whatever it is. We'll do this, but to do it right, we're going to need a few things. Number one, we need both you and my executive sitting next to me right here to agree, hear the readout of the proof of value exercise. So we can actually hear from the team, how did it actually go? What were the big rocks? What were the things that actually moved? Number two, we got to agree that this exercise is going to be time bound. Because I've been in situations before where they just get pushed and pushed, other priorities come up, and then it never really goes anywhere because we can't find resolution. And number three, we have to agree on assumptions and metrics. So number one, if we're going to do this, we want to be able to see the bullseye. So we need to agree on what's the bullseye. We're not going to try to say, hey, you have to buy it if we hit it, but we do want you to acknowledge that we got the technical win if we hit the bullseye measurably. And number two, can you please ensure that your team will share with us for what we're trying to improve? Because it can be, but we don't know the benchmark. The customer project team says, this is great, thanks. If you please wrap that up for us, give it to us in a deck. We're going to go discuss internally and we will get back to you. And they'll know that you made things 10 times better. But you'll be wondering, was it 2x? Was it 4? Who knows? So if you don't get those metrics up front, and if you don't get agreement for the executive engagement either at the end or throughout, you'll never get it later.
Really appreciate you breaking that down. And, I feel like I could dig a lot on the POC process, but I'm really glad you brought up metrics and assumptions, because one of the things that we talked about that was integral to these deal closings is a role called value engineering. So can you talk about the role and the imperative role that value engineering plays in closing mega deals?
So the premise of the value engineer starts with the fact that large deals do not happen without not just executive engagement, executive sponsorship and champions, because every large organization is filled with entropy and hierarchy. And without somebody who is going to be internal with authority, budget, decision-making power, herding the cats, large change just doesn't happen. It's not really possible that it happens at the lower levels. Ideas can come from the bottom, but decisions come from the top. So if that is true, then they need a massive validation for making that big change. Enter the value engineer. Because let's just be clear, the vast majority of sellers and the vast majority of pre-sales people are not well versed at putting together senior executive value propositions. They're good at worker bee value propositions, maybe mid-level manager value propositions, but across our space, the upper end mostly lies with people who are conversant in finance or in management consulting.
Could you give us, if you're willing, a little bit of a tactical example of how vital someone who could speak that lingo and that language was to one of your deals closing? Was there something that maybe was not going according to plan, and the value engineer and the strategy that they took really allowed that 8-figure deal to close?
I mean, I have to say that the person that played the role of the value engineer in the biggest deal that I ever did was my VP of sales. He's in the book that I wrote, and he's a very colorful character. He's the kind of guy who, as we were working through the deal, he would call me in all hours of the night on his motorcycle between his homes in Paris and Nice. And he had a microphone in his helmet, and I could hardly hear him because the wind was so bad. And he would say, in that one spreadsheet where we're measuring this business process, I think it was J35, the value should be 245 million, not 168, right? And I would check it, and he's like, right. He was that kind of guy. And he taught me the most important principle, or maybe a couple of principles about value engineering, which is you can argue anything that you can back up. And his go-to backup was numbers. Now, To roll with this example, this was an existing customer. So we had lots of data about working with this customer for the previous 3+ years, 3 to 5 years. And he basically said, I need you to collate all this data and put it in a massive spreadsheet, but make it this way, this way, this way, so I know how to digest it. And then he'd go off and he'd just digest all this data. And then he'd start pinging me when he's on his motorcycle in the middle of the night with his own process to figure out our arguments. And we came up with multiple arguments, but we had to role play them internally. If we came up with 10, we'd stick with 2. And through this process that we did over weeks and weeks and weeks, we stress tested a small number of very high impact arguments that justified why we needed to change this part of the engagement, that part of the engagement, why it should be so much more expensive, because the value of this piece would be so much greater. It'd be 3 to 10x whatever the increase in price was going to be. So I don't know if this is answering your question exactly, but that is the heart of value engineering, is finding what's going to justify a project. What are the chances of success, and how successful could we be? How much can we move the needle if we do this?
I appreciate that breakdown. And I'm glad you brought that up because, as we get to the end here, one of the things that we as PreSales Collective in our actual Leader Elevate program, we're trying to stress is for solutions professionals to start running their team like a business. And we're starting to teach people to be more data driven and understand even the metrics for their team and their impact on the business. One of our concepts in our ongoing roundtables is how and why you need a value engineering team within your solutions organization, because you need to be able to run the numbers and run your organization like a business, quantify the impact that justifies your existence within an organization. And then if you start talking about your impact on deal closure, that allows solutions professionals to kind of change in terms of how we're looked at within an organization. And I have to thank a woman by the name of Helen Yu early in my career who said, James, if I can give you any advice, you need to start running your team like a business. You need to understand the numbers. You need to understand the metrics. You need to understand finances. And if you do that, it will take you very far in your career. And as we, as a profession, continue to think about what's next for us and what's the next step in our evolution, it is the numbers, it is the data, it is the value, it is the revenue. So hearing how you talk about value engineering is this step that solutions professionals and the mature ones are currently doing. It rolls into this org so that this org can continue to provide values to sophisticated sellers like yourself who can go and hunt these big deals that change an organization, right? That really move a needle of an organization and allow the best companies in the world to separate. So I'm actually really glad that you went there and talked about that.
One last thing that I would add to that is I value my pre-sales partners a whole lot. The one piece of advice that I would give to solutions engineers in general is a piece of advice that I've taken to heart, which is you get to hang around with people who you sound like. And if you sound, now everybody hates this term, but let's just get it out there. If you sound like a demo dolly, that's who you're going to hang around with. If you sound like a business person, that's who you'll hang around with. And a lot of this is the sales function's fault of pigeonholing solutions engineers into the demo world. And if solutions engineers take the initiative to speak a different language, that's going to get the attention of sales so fast. The whole nature of the relationship can change very quickly.
It's been great having you on the podcast. I really appreciate your time today. Appreciate your methodology. For me, I've really enjoyed getting to know you and hearing how you approach business. I've learned a lot from you and just want to say thanks again for all that you've done for me and joining us on the podcast today.
Total honor to be here. I'm so excited to do it. Thanks for having me.
All right, PreSales Collective. I hope you enjoy listening to Jamal's perspective today. I was so happy to hear him give advice at the end around how solutions professionals can continue to evolve and elevate their game. We hear it all the time that we need to speak like the people that we want to be talking to. And I think what happens in a lot of organizations is what Jamal said. Our sales organization, our sales motion puts the solutions professional in a box. demo dollies, demo jockeys, whatever it might be, but there's so much more to the role. And when you unlock the sophistication of solutions professionals, you can see the impact it has on the business. And you heard Jamal say it, he utilized a team. And if we think about the expansion of solutions orgs to have multiple different layers of specialty roles, or I've heard recently called accelerator roles, those are those people that have deep expertise in certain subjects that can support the core solutions professionals. And if you think about swarming a deal and speaking to those executives and speaking about value, this is when the impact of this role is so profound in organizations. I just appreciate hearing Jamal's approach to business. I mentioned on the podcast that I feel that there's just layers to sales. There's layers to solutions professionals too. But hearing a salesperson really come with a point of view and come with a strategy and a perspective. And if you reflect back on some of the best salespeople you've probably ever worked with, that is what they do. They could be a solutions consultant if they wanted to. Some of the best ones can, but some of the best ones just understand how to unlock the value of the solutions team. They know how to speak to executives, and they know how to progress and move a deal forward by having a well thought out and developed point of view. So I appreciate Jamal joining us on the podcast today, and we'll actually continue on this subject a little bit more over the next couple of months. As always, PreSales Collective, you can check out our upcoming events and content in our member hub. We hope that you're connecting with other peers via our connections platform. You're joining us for our enablement programs and our virtual conferences. And as always, we'll see you next week.